The dust cloud rose so high behind Penelope Jensen's flock that the cattlemen of Platteville, Colorado, could see it coming from 3 miles out. And every man who caught sight of it felt his jaw clench with the kind of rage that had started range wars in 1878. She sat astride her sorrel mare, a woman of 22 with auburn hair braided down her back and eyes the color of summer sage, leading 2,000 sheep straight into the heart of cattle country like she owned every blade of grass between the Front Range and the Kansas border. Behind her rolled 2 covered wagons driven by her hired hands, both grizzled men who had worked sheep in Montana and knew what kind of trouble they were riding into. The sheep flowed across the prairie like a woolly river, their bleating carrying on the September wind, and Penelope kept her gaze fixed on the town ahead, her heart hammering against her ribs even as she kept her spine straight and her chin high. She had inherited the flock from her father 6 months ago when consumption finally took him in their homestead outside Greeley. He had been a sheep man through and through, had taught her everything about raising quality stock, about breeding for fine wool, about moving a flock across open range. But Greeley was crowded now, the grazing lands carved up and fought over, and she had heard that the grasslands around Platteville were rich and empty. What no one had bothered to tell her, or what she had chosen to ignore, was that those grasslands were empty for a reason. They belonged to the cattle ranchers who had claimed this territory first, who saw sheep as vermin that cropped grass too short and ruined water sources and carried diseases that could devastate a cattle herd. The first cowboy to intercept her came thundering across the prairie on a paint gelding, his hat pulled low and his face twisted in fury. He was young, maybe 19, with the kind of raw-boned look that spoke of hard work and harder winters. He reined up 20 feet from her, his horse dancing sideways as the sheep continued their relentless forward motion. "Turn that flock around right now," he shouted over the bleating. "You cannot bring sheep into this valley. This is cattle country." Penelope pulled her mare to a halt and met his glare with steady eyes. "This is open range, last I checked, public domain. I have as much right to graze here as anyone. The hell you do." The young cowboy spat into the dust. "You bring those woolly maggots onto our grass and they will ruin it for the cattle. Every rancher from here to Denver will ride out to stop you." "Then let them come," Penelope said, her voice calmer than she felt. "I am not breaking any laws. I have livestock that need grazing, and I intend to settle here." The cowboy stared at her like she had sprouted a second head, then wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward town, no doubt to spread the alarm. Penelope took a deep breath and signaled her hired hands to keep the flock moving. Her heart was racing, but she refused to show weakness. She had gambled everything on this move, had sold her father's homestead, and used the money to buy supplies and hire help. There was no turning back now. By the time she reached the outskirts of Platteville, a crowd had gathered. 24 cowboys sat on their horses in a rough line, their faces grim, and behind them stood townspeople who had come out to witness the confrontation. Penelope scanned the faces, looking for the law, and spotted a man with a tin star pinned to his vest standing off to one side. He was older, maybe 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and a weathered face that had seen too many range disputes. She rode straight toward him, leaving her hired hands to keep the sheep moving toward the open grassland beyond the town. "Sheriff," she called out as she approached. "I am Penelope Jensen, and I am here to settle on the public range. I wanted to make sure you know I am not causing trouble. I am just a rancher looking for grazing land." The sheriff pushed his hat back and studied her with tired eyes. "Miss Jensen, you are causing trouble whether you mean to or not. This valley has been cattle country for 15 years. These men have built their lives on raising beef, and they are not going to welcome sheep onto their range. With respect, Sheriff, it is not their range. It is public domain. The law allows me to graze here." "The law," said a deep voice from the crowd, and Penelope turned to see a man riding forward on a magnificent bay stallion. He was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled over his collar and eyes so blue they looked like pieces of sky. His face was sun-bronzed and handsome in a rough-hewn way, with a strong jaw and a mouth set in a hard line. He wore a black hat and a leather vest over a blue shirt, and there was an air of authority about him that made the other cowboys shift in their saddles. "The law says a lot of things, but out here, we live by different rules." Penelope felt something shift in her chest as she met his gaze, a flutter of awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the raw presence of the man. She pushed the feeling aside and lifted her chin. "And you are Zachary Dalton. I own the Diamond D Ranch, the largest spread in this valley, and I am telling you right now that if you bring those sheep onto this range, there will be consequences. Are you threatening me, Mr. Dalton? I am warning you." His voice was low and dangerous, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, maybe even grudging respect. "Sheep ruin grazing land. They crop the grass too short, their hooves tear up the ground, and they foul water sources. If you run sheep here, you will destroy the range for our cattle, and we cannot allow that." Penelope felt her temper flare. She had heard these arguments before, and they were based more on prejudice than fact. "Sheep graze differently than cattle, Mr. Dalton, but they do not destroy the land if they are managed properly. I know how to rotate my flock, how to keep them moving so they do not overgraze. I am not some ignorant homesteader who does not know what she is doing. I grew up raising sheep." "Then you should have stayed where you came from," Zachary said, his jaw tight, "because you are not welcome here." The other cowboys muttered agreement, and Penelope felt the weight of their hostility pressing down on her. But she had not come this far to be turned away by hard words and angry men. "I am staying," she said clearly, "and I expect the law to protect my right to be here." The sheriff sighed and glanced at Zachary, then back at Penelope. "Miss Jensen, you have the legal right to graze on public range, that much is true. But I cannot protect you if these men decide to take matters into their own hands. I am just one man, and there are limits to what I can do." "Then I will protect myself," Penelope said. She met Zachary's eyes again, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. There was anger there, yes, but also something else, something that looked almost like admiration. "I am not afraid of hard work or hard men, Sheriff. I will take my chances." She turned her mare and rode back to her flock without waiting for a response. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped the reins tight and kept her face composed. Behind her, she could feel Zachary Dalton's eyes on her back, and the sensation sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. Over the next week, Penelope set up her camp on a stretch of grassland 2 miles east of town, near a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains. Her hired hands erected a rough shelter from canvas and lumber, and she staked out her territory with the kind of determination that came from having no other options. The sheep grazed peacefully, moving across the land in a slow, methodical pattern that kept them from overgrazing any one spot. Penelope rode among them every day, checking for illness, looking for signs of predators, and keeping a wary eye out for cowboys. They came on the 3rd day, a group of 5 men led by a wiry ranch hand with a pockmarked face and mean eyes. They rode into her camp at dusk, their horses trampling the edge of her flock and sending the sheep scattering in panic. Penelope came running from her tent, her heart in her throat, and found the men sitting on their horses in a loose circle around her shelter. "You need to move on," the pockmarked man said without preamble. "Mr. Dalton sent us to deliver a message. You are not wanted here, and if you do not leave, things are going to get unpleasant." Penelope felt anger surge through her, hot and fierce. "Mr. Dalton does not own this land, and he has no right to send you to threaten me. Now get out of my camp before I report you to the sheriff." The man laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "The sheriff is not going to help you, lady. You are on your own out here, and you would be smart to realize it." One of her hired hands, a man named Tom who was pushing 60 and had a bad leg, stepped out of the shelter with a rifle in his hands. "She told you to leave. Now move along before someone gets hurt." The pockmarked man's eyes narrowed, but he must have seen something in Tom's face that made him think twice. He spat into the dirt and wheeled his horse around. "You have been warned," he called over his shoulder, and then the group rode off into the gathering darkness. Penelope stood trembling in the dust, her fists clenched at her sides. Tom limped over to her and rested a hand on her shoulder. "You holding up all right, Miss Jensen?" "I am fine," she said, though her voice shook. "Thank you, Tom. I do not know what I would do without you." "You would manage," he said with a crooked smile. "You are your father's daughter, that much is clear. But these men are not going to give up easy. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." Penelope nodded, her mind already racing ahead to what she would need to do to protect her flock and her claim. She had bought land rights to a small parcel near the creek, enough to give her a legal foothold, but the rest of her grazing was on public range, and that made her vulnerable. She needed to prove that her sheep were not harming the land, that she could coexist with the cattlemen. And more than that, she needed to find a way to make her operation profitable enough that she could not be driven out by economic pressure. The idea came to her that night as she sat by the campfire, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. Wool. The price of wool had been climbing steadily over the past few years as demand increased back east and in Europe. If she could produce high-quality fleece and get it to market, she could make enough money to secure her position here, maybe even buy more land and expand her operation. It was a gamble, but everything about this venture was a gamble. She spent the next morning in town, visiting the general store and asking about wool buyers. The storekeeper, a round man named Pemberton with spectacles perched on his nose, listened to her questions with growing interest. "There is a wool broker who comes through Denver every spring," he said thoughtfully. "Name is Harrison. He buys for the big mills back east. But miss, I have to tell you, most of the wool out here is pretty rough. The ranchers who run sheep do not put much effort into breeding for quality. They are more interested in quantity." "My sheep are merino crosses," Penelope said. "My father spent years developing the line. The fleece is fine and soft, nothing like the coarse wool from range sheep." Pemberton raised his eyebrows. "If that is true, you might have something. Fine wool fetches a premium price, but you would need to prove it to Harrison, and he would not be here until spring." "Then I will wait until spring," Penelope said. "In the meantime, I need supplies to get through the winter. Do you extend credit?" Pemberton hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window where several cowboys were loitering outside. "Miss Jensen, I do not mean any disrespect, but extending you credit would not be good for my business. The cattlemen are my main customers, and they would not take kindly to me helping you." Penelope felt frustration rise in her throat, but she forced it down. "I understand. Thank you for your time." She left the store with her head high, but inside she was calculating. She had enough cash to buy basic supplies for another month, maybe 2 if she was careful. After that, she would need to find another source of income or credit. The situation was more precarious than she had anticipated, but she was not ready to give up. As she untied her horse from the hitching post, she became aware of someone watching her. She turned and found Zachary Dalton standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon. His arms crossed over his chest, and his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, and Penelope felt that strange flutter in her chest again, that awareness of him that was entirely inappropriate given that he was her adversary. He pushed away from the wall and walked toward her, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. There was a faint scar along his jaw, a white line that spoke of some old fight or accident, and his hands were calloused and strong-looking. "Miss Jensen," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I heard you were asking about wool buyers. Is that any of your business, Mr. Dalton? It is if you are planning to stay here and compete with my cattle operation." He studied her face, and something shifted in his expression, a softening she had not expected. "Look, I did not ride into town to harass you. I wanted to talk to you, just the two of us, without a crowd watching." Penelope felt her defenses rise, but curiosity won out. "All right, talk." He glanced around, then gestured toward a quiet alley between two buildings. "Over here. I do not need the whole town listening in." She followed him, keeping her hand near the knife she wore at her belt, though she did not really think he meant her harm. When they were out of sight of the main street, he turned to face her and took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "I respect what you are trying to do," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "Coming out here alone, starting a new operation, standing up to all of us. That takes guts, but you have to understand this is not just about stubbornness or tradition. The cattle industry is fragile out here. We have lost herds to drought, to disease, to hard winters. If sheep come in and damage the range, it could ruin us." Penelope felt a flicker of sympathy despite herself. "I understand that, Mr. Dalton, but my situation is just as precarious. I have nowhere else to go. My father left me that flock, and it is all I have in the world. I cannot just walk away because it makes things difficult for you." He met her eyes, and she saw frustration there, but also something that looked like genuine conflict. "What if we could come to some kind of agreement? Keep your sheep to certain areas, away from the main cattle range." "And who decides which areas those are?" Penelope asked. "You, the other cattlemen. That is just a slower way of pushing me out, and we both know it." Zachary was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then he said, "You are right. That is not fair." He sighed and settled his hat back on his head. "I do not know what the answer is, Miss Jensen, but I wanted you to know that I am not your enemy, even if it seems that way. I'm just trying to protect what I have built. And I am trying to build something of my own," Penelope said softly. "Maybe we are not so different, you and I." Their eyes met and held, and Penelope felt that flutter again, stronger this time, a pull toward this man that made no sense at all. He was her adversary, the one person standing between her and success in this valley. But there was something in his eyes, a depth and complexity that called to something in her, and she found herself wanting to know more about him, to understand what drove him. "Maybe not," Zachary said quietly. Then he stepped back, breaking the moment. "But that does not change the situation. The other ranchers are not as patient as I am. They will do whatever it takes to drive you out, and I might not be able to stop them." "Then I will deal with that when it comes," Penelope said. "But thank you for the warning." He nodded and walked away, his long stride carrying him back toward the main street. Penelope stood in the alley for a moment, her heart still racing, and wondered what had just happened between them. It felt like more than just a conversation between rivals. It felt like the beginning of something she could not quite name. The next few weeks brought an early cold snap that sent temperatures plummeting and dusted the mountains with snow. Penelope worked from dawn until dark, making sure her sheep had adequate shelter and enough feed to supplement the thinning grass. The hard work kept her from dwelling too much on her precarious situation, but at night, lying in her bedroll in the canvas shelter, she could not help but worry. Winter was coming, and she did not know if she had the resources to make it through to spring. The cattlemen kept their distance, but she could feel their eyes on her whenever she rode into town for supplies. The hostility was palpable, a living thing that pressed down on her shoulders and made every trip into Platteville an ordeal. But she held her head high and refused to show weakness. Even when the storekeeper started charging her higher prices than he charged other customers, even when the blacksmith made her wait hours to get her mare rishad while he attended to every cowboy who came through the door. Zachary Dalton she saw only from a distance, riding the range with his men or herding cattle toward winter pastures. He never approached her again, but sometimes she would catch him watching her, and the intensity of his gaze would send that now familiar shiver through her. She told herself it was just wariness, just the natural tension between competitors. But late at night, she would remember the sound of his voice in that alley, the way he had looked at her with something that was not quite animosity, and her heart would skip a beat. In early November, disaster struck. Penelope woke one morning to find that a section of her flock had been scattered during the night, driven off by riders who left clear tracks in the frost. 20 sheep were missing, and when she and Tom finally found them, they were miles away, exhausted and frightened. 2 lambs had been injured, their legs broken, and Penelope had to put them down herself, tears streaming down her face as she did what had to be done. She rode into town that afternoon in a fury and went straight to the sheriff's office. The lawman looked up from his desk with a weary expression that said he had been expecting her. "Someone drove off part of my flock last night," she said without preamble. "I want you to investigate and bring charges." The sheriff sighed and set down his pen. "Miss Jensen, do you have any proof of who did it?" "I have tracks. Multiple riders coming from the direction of the Diamond D." "Tracks are not proof, and you know it. Could have been anyone. Could have been drifters looking to cause trouble." "Sheriff, you know as well as I do that this was deliberate harassment. The cattlemen are trying to drive me out." "Maybe so," the sheriff said, "but I cannot arrest anyone without evidence. And even if I could, do you really think a jury in this town would convict a local rancher for chasing off some sheep? You are fighting an uphill battle here, miss." Penelope felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "So you are saying I am on my own?" "I am saying the law can only do so much. You might want to consider cutting your losses and moving on before things get worse." Penelope turned and walked out without another word. She stood on the boardwalk, breathing hard, trying to master the rage and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She was not going to give up, she could not, but she did not know how much more she could endure. "Miss Jensen." She turned to find Zachary Dalton standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands and his expression troubled. Her anger flared hot and immediate. "Did you come to gloat?" she demanded. "Or maybe to threaten me again?" "No." He stepped closer, and she saw genuine distress in his eyes. "I heard about your sheep. I wanted to say I had nothing to do with it, and I am sorry it happened. Your men were the ones who did it. The tracks lead straight from your ranch." "My men were all accounted for last night. I made sure of it after I heard what happened. Someone is trying to make it look like I am responsible, but I swear to you, it was not me." Penelope stared at him, trying to read the truth in his face. She wanted to believe him, and that impulse scared her more than anything else. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I am telling you the truth." He took another step closer, and his voice dropped low. Look, I know I have given you every reason to see me as the enemy, but I am not the kind of man who sneaks around in the dark hurting animals. If I wanted you gone, I would face you directly. Then who did it? Could have been any of a dozen ranchers in this valley, or their hired hands acting on their own. There are men who see you as a threat, and they are not going to wait around for you to get established. Penelope felt some of her anger drain away, replaced by exhaustion. I do not know how much more of this I can take. Zachary looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Come work for me, she blinked, certain she had misheard. What? Come work for me at the Diamond D. Bring your sheep, run them on a section of my land where they will not interfere with my cattle. I will pay you a wage and you will have protection from the other ranchers. Why would you do that? He was quiet, his blue eyes searching her face. Because you deserve a fair chance, and because I do not want to see you get hurt. Penelope felt something warm unfurl in her chest, but she pushed it down. I do not need your charity, Mr. Dalton. It is not charity. You said your sheep produce quality wool. If that is true, it could be a profitable side venture. I would be making a business investment and you would have a safe place to operate. It makes sense for both of us. She wanted to say no, wanted to maintain her independence and her pride, but the truth was, she was running out of options. Winter was coming, her supplies were dwindling, and the hostility of the other ranchers was not going to lessen. If she did not accept help, she might lose everything. I would want a contract, she said finally. Something in writing that protects my rights and my flock. Done. Come out to the ranch tomorrow, and we will draw something up. Penelope nodded slowly, her mind racing. This was either the smartest decision she had ever made or the biggest mistake, and she would not know which until it was too late to change course. But looking into Zachary Dalton's eyes, seeing the sincerity there, she felt something shift between them, a tentative bridge being built across the chasm of their rivalry. All right, she said. I will come tomorrow. His face broke into a smile, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his features from merely handsome to breathtaking. Good. I will see you then. He settled his hat back on his head and walked away, and Penelope stood watching him go, her heart doing strange things in her chest. She had just agreed to work for the man who had been her chief adversary, to put herself under his protection and into his orbit. It should have felt like defeat, but instead it felt like possibility, like the opening of a door she had not known existed. The Diamond D Ranch spread across 5,000 acres of prime grassland, with the Rocky Mountains rising like a jagged wall to the west, and the prairie rolling out endlessly to the east. Penelope rode in the next morning with her 2 hired hands trailing behind, leading her flock in a long, bleeding column. As they approached the ranch buildings, she felt her breath catch at the scale of the operation. There was a large main house built of logs and stone, a massive barn, several bunkhouses, corrals filled with horses and cattle, and outbuildings for equipment and supplies. This was not just a ranch. It was an empire, and Zachary Dalton was its king. He came out to meet her, flanked by a grizzled foreman with a gray mustache and skeptical eyes. Zachary had his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and Penelope could see the corded muscle in his forearms, the physical strength that came from years of hard labor. He looked like he belonged here, like he was part of the landscape itself. "Miss Jensen," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to the Diamond D. This is my foreman, Hank Cordell. He will show your men where to set up camp and where your sheep can graze." Hank gave her a curt nod, his expression making it clear what he thought of having sheep on cattle range, but he did not voice any objections. Zachary's word was law here, and that was evident in the way the ranch hands deferred to him. Over the next hour, Penelope and Zachary hammered out the details of their agreement in his office, a wood-paneled room lined with books and ledgers. He offered her a section of land along the northern edge of his property, near a creek with good water, and agreed to pay her a monthly wage plus a percentage of the profits from the wool sales. In return, she would manage her flock in a way that did not interfere with his cattle operation and would provide him with regular reports on her progress. "This is more than fair," Penelope said as she read through the contract he had written out in a bold, clear hand. "You are taking a risk on me." "I have a feeling you are worth the risk," Zachary said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. Their eyes met across the desk, and she felt that pull again, that magnetic attraction that seemed to grow stronger every time they were near each other. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked quietly. "It is not just about the wool, is it?" Zachary leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "When I first came to this valley 10 years ago, I had nothing. Just a horse, a saddle, and a dream of building something that would last. The other ranchers did not want me here either. They said I was too young, too inexperienced, that I would fail and bring everyone else down with me, but I proved them wrong. I worked harder than anyone, took risks, and built this ranch into what it is today." He paused, his eyes intent on her face. "When I look at you, I see that same determination, that same refusal to give up, and I guess I want to give you the chance that someone should have given me." Penelope felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I will not let you down." "I know you will not." They signed the contract, and Penelope felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had a safe place for her flock, a steady income, and an ally in the most powerful rancher in the valley. More than that, she had a chance to prove that sheep and cattle could coexist, that her vision for a different kind of ranching was viable. Over the following weeks, Penelope threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She set up a proper camp on the land Zachary had given her, building a sturdy shelter and setting up pens for the sheep. Tom and her other hired hand, a younger man named Jesse, worked alongside her, and slowly the operation began to take shape. The sheep thrived on the good grass and clean water, and Penelope spent her days monitoring their health, checking their fleeces, and planning for the spring shearing. She saw Zachary almost every day. He would ride out to check on her progress, ostensibly to make sure she was holding up her end of the bargain, but the visits began to last longer and longer. They would talk about ranching, about the land, about their lives before they came to this valley. Penelope learned that Zachary had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, that he had come west after his father died to make his fortune, that he had survived blizzards and droughts and cattle rustlers to build the Diamond D into what it was today. He was only 27, just 5 years older than her, but he carried himself with the authority of a much older man, seasoned by hard experience and harder choices. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Greeley, about her father who had loved his sheep more than anything except his daughter, about the long, lonely months after he died when she had to figure out how to run the operation on her own. Zachary listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before, and she found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with business. One afternoon in late November, he brought her a book from his library, a volume on sheep breeding that he thought might interest her. They sat together on a log near her campfire, the book open between them, and as they discussed the finer points of bloodlines and wool quality, Penelope became acutely aware of how close he was sitting, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his shoulder brushed against hers when he leaned in to point out a passage. "You really know your sheep," he said, and there was admiration in his voice. I have never met anyone who understands livestock the way you do." "My father was a good teacher," Penelope said. "He taught me to see each animal as an individual, to pay attention to the small details that make the difference between a mediocre flock and an exceptional one. It shows." Zachary turned to look at her, and suddenly the space between them seemed to shrink. "You know, when you first rode into Platteville, I thought you were either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. I am starting to think you are both." Penelope laughed, a soft sound that hung in the cold air between them. "I will take that as a compliment. It was meant as one." His voice had gone low and rough, and his eyes were fixed on her mouth. Penelope felt her breath catch, felt the world narrow down to just the two of them and the crackle of the fire. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek, and she leaned into the touch without thinking. "Penelope," he said, her name a whisper on his lips, and then he was leaning in and she was meeting him halfway, and their mouths came together in a kiss that sent lightning through her veins. It was tentative at first, a gentle exploration, but then Zachary's hand came up to cup the back of her head and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and consuming. Penelope's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and she felt 10 years of loneliness and longing pour out of her into this kiss, into this man who had somehow become the center of her world without her even realizing it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers and said, "I have been wanting to do that since the first day I saw you." "Even though you were furious with me?" Penelope asked, her voice shaky. "Especially because I was furious with you. You challenged me in a way no one ever has, and I could not stop thinking about you." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "This complicates things." "Yes, it does," Penelope agreed, but she was smiling and so was he, and in that moment the complications did not matter. All that mattered was the warmth of his hand in hers, and the promise of something new and terrifying and wonderful growing between them. Winter descended on Colorado with a vengeance that year, bringing blizzards that buried the prairie under 3 feet of snow and temperatures that dropped so low the creek froze solid. Penelope moved into one of the smaller bunkhouses on the Diamond D, sharing space with 2 ranch hands who treated her with cautious respect now that she was under Zachary's protection. The sheep huddled in the shelter she had built, and she checked on them twice a day, breaking ice from water troughs and hauling hay from the barn. Zachary was a constant presence, working alongside his men to keep the cattle fed and sheltered, riding out in weather that would have sent most men running for cover. Penelope saw the kind of leader he was, the way his men trusted him, the way he never asked them to do anything he was not willing to do himself. And in the evenings, when the work was done, he would come find her, and they would sit together in the warmth of the main house, talking and laughing and slowly falling deeper into something that felt inevitable and right. The other ranchers in the valley were not happy about her presence on the Diamond D, but with Zachary's protection, there was little they could do. A few tried to pressure him into sending her away, but he stood firm, and gradually the protests died down. Penelope knew she had not won them over, but at least they were no longer actively trying to destroy her. In February, when the worst of the winter had passed and the days began to lengthen, Penelope started preparing for the spring shearing. She ordered supplies from Denver, sharpened her shears, and set up a workspace in one of the barns. Zachary watched her preparations with interest, and one evening he asked if he could help with the shearing. "You want to shear sheep?" Penelope asked, amused. "I thought cattlemen considered that beneath them." "I want to understand your operation," Zachary said. "Besides, I am curious to see if your wool is really as good as you claim." "Oh, it is," Penelope said confidently. "You will see." The shearing took 3 weeks, with Tom and Jesse handling most of the work while Penelope supervised, and Zachary learned the ropes. It was hard, dirty, exhausting labor, but there was a satisfaction in seeing the fleeces pile up, soft and creamy white, some of the finest wool Penelope had ever produced. She sorted them carefully, separating the best fleeces from the rest, and bundled them for transport to Denver. When the wool broker arrived in March, Penelope was ready. Harrison was a lean, sharp-eyed man in his 50s, and he examined her fleeces with the critical eye of someone who had seen thousands of wool samples. She waited, her heart in her throat, as he ran the fibers through his fingers, held them up to the light, and tested their strength. Finally, he looked up at her with something like surprise in his eyes. "Miss Jensen, this is exceptional quality. Merino level may be better." "Where did you say you got these sheep?" "My father bred them," Penelope said, trying to keep the triumph out of her voice. "He worked on the bloodline for 20 years. Well, he knew what he was doing. I will take every pound you can sell me, and I will pay you top price. This wool will fetch a premium back east." The price he quoted made Penelope's knees weak. It was 3 times what she had expected, enough to pay off her debts, buy more breeding stock, and still have money left over to expand her operation. When Harrison left with her wool loaded onto his wagons, she stood in the barnyard and felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Zachary found her there and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried out months of fear and tension and uncertainty. "You did it," he murmured into her hair. "You proved them all wrong." "We did it," Penelope corrected, looking up at him. "I could not have done this without you." "You would have found a way," Zachary said, but his eyes were warm with pride. "You are the most stubborn, determined woman I have ever met." "Is that a compliment?" "The highest one I know." He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of promise and possibility. And when they finally broke apart, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that she was in love with this man, this cowboy who had started as her enemy and become her champion. Word of Penelope's wool sale spread through Platteville like wildfire, and the reaction was mixed. Some of the townspeople, particularly the merchants who stood to profit from a thriving wool trade, were openly pleased. Others, especially the cattlemen, were resentful and worried. If sheep could be more profitable than cattle, what did that mean for the future of the valley? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. In April, 2 more sheep ranchers arrived in Platteville, having heard about Penelope's success. They were brothers from Wyoming, experienced shepherds looking for new range, and they came to Penelope asking for advice. She met with them at the Diamond D, with Zachary sitting in on the conversation, and talked about grazing patterns, water management, and how to coexist with cattle operations. "The key is rotation," she explained, pointing to a map of the valley. "If you keep your flocks moving and do not overgraze any one area, the land can support both sheep and cattle. And if you breed for quality wool, you can make a good living on a smaller flock." The brothers listened intently, and when they left, they had a plan for setting up their operation in a way that would minimize conflict with the cattlemen. Zachary watched them go with a thoughtful expression. "This is just the beginning, is it not?" he said. "More shepherds are going to come now." "Probably," Penelope agreed. "Does that worry you?" "It should," Zachary said. "But honestly, after seeing what you have accomplished, I think there might be room for both industries here. The valley is big enough if everyone is willing to work together." "You are a remarkable man, Zachary Dalton," Penelope said softly. "Not many cattlemen would be willing to change their minds." "I am learning," he said with a wry smile. "You have been a good teacher." That evening, Zachary invited Penelope to dinner at the main house, and for the first time, they were truly alone. He had given his housekeeper the night off, and he cooked for her himself, a simple meal of steak and potatoes that tasted better than anything she had eaten in months. They ate by candlelight, talking and laughing, and when the meal was finished, Zachary took her hand and led her into the parlor. "I have something I need to say," he began, and there was a nervousness in his voice that she had never heard before. "These past months with you have been the best of my life. You have challenged me, infuriated me, inspired me, and made me see the world in a completely different way. I did not plan on falling in love with you, but I have, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Penelope felt her heart swell with emotion. "Zachary, I love you too. I think I have since that day in the alley when you first tried to talk to me like I was a person instead of just a problem to be solved." He smiled and dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond. "Penelope Jensen, will you marry me? Will you stay here with me and build a life together, raising sheep and cattle and proving that different ways can work side by side?" Penelope did not even have to think about it. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him with all the love and joy bursting out of her. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the church in Platteville with the whole town in attendance. The cattlemen came, some grudgingly and others with genuine warmth, and the sheep ranchers came, and the townspeople came, and everyone ate and drank and celebrated the union of the valley's most unlikely couple. Penelope wore a dress of cream wool that she had woven herself from her sheep's fleece, and Zachary wore his best suit and could not stop smiling. After the wedding, they honeymooned at the ranch, spending a week alone in the main house while the ranch hands kept the operations running. Penelope discovered that Zachary was a tender and passionate lover, attentive to her needs and generous with his affection. They stayed in bed late into the mornings, talking and making love and planning their future together. "I want to expand the wool operation," Penelope said one morning as they lay tangled together in the sheets. "Bring in more breeding stock. Maybe start a cooperative with the other sheep ranchers so we can pool our resources and negotiate better prices." "I think that is a brilliant idea," Zachary said, running his fingers through her hair. "And I have been thinking about diversifying the cattle operation, maybe raising some specialty breeds that can command premium prices. If we are going to prove that both industries can thrive here, we need to show innovation on both sides." "We make a good team," Penelope said, turning to look at him. "Who would have thought that the sheep woman and the cattle king would end up together?" "I would not have believed it if someone had told me 6 months ago," Zachary admitted. "But now I cannot imagine anything else. You are my partner in every sense of the word." Over the next year, their operations flourished. Penelope's wool continued to fetch premium prices, and she used the profits to buy more land and expand her flock. Zachary experimented with crossbreeding his cattle to produce higher quality beef, and together they turned the Diamond D into one of the most successful and innovative ranches in Colorado. The other sheep ranchers in the valley followed Penelope's lead, and gradually a new equilibrium emerged, with sheep and cattle sharing the range in a way that benefited everyone. In the spring of 1880, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Zachary one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and she felt the tremor of emotion running through him. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice thick with wonder. "A son or daughter to carry on what we have built here." "I hope they have your strength and your vision," Penelope said. "And I hope they have your courage and your stubborn refusal to give up," Zachary replied, making her laugh. Their son was born in December, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-green eyes. They named him Samuel Dalton, after Penelope's father, and from the moment Zachary held him for the first time, he was utterly devoted. Penelope watched her husband rock their son to sleep, singing old cowboy songs in a low, rumbling voice, and felt her heart overflow with love for both of them. Samuel grew up surrounded by sheep and cattle, learning to ride before he could walk, absorbing the rhythms of ranch life with the ease of a child born to it. When he was 3, Penelope gave birth to twin daughters, Grace and Clara, and the house that had once seemed too large for just 2 people was suddenly filled with noise and laughter and chaos. Zachary proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching his children to rope and ride and respect the land that sustained them. The wool cooperative that Penelope founded grew to include a dozen ranchers, and the prices they negotiated made sheep ranching one of the most profitable industries in the valley. Some of the cattlemen grumbled, but most adapted, and a few even started running small sheep operations alongside their cattle. Zachary became an advocate for cooperation between the different ranching interests, using his influence to mediate disputes and find solutions that benefited everyone. By 1885, Platteville had transformed from a struggling cattle town into a thriving agricultural center, known throughout Colorado for its quality wool and beef. Penelope and Zachary's ranch was the crown jewel, a model of innovation and cooperation that attracted visitors from as far away as California and Texas. They gave tours, shared their techniques, and mentored young ranchers who wanted to follow in their footsteps. One evening in the summer of 1886, Penelope and Zachary sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Samuel was 8 now, tall and lanky, chasing his sisters around with a stick while they shrieked with laughter. The sheep grazed peacefully in the distance, and beyond them, the cattle dotted the hillsides like dark spots on a canvas. "You ever think about that first day you rode into Platteville?" Zachary asked, his hand finding hers. "When I was so angry at you for bringing sheep into cattle country." Penelope laughed. "I think about it all the time. I was so scared, but I was determined not to show it. And you were so intimidating, sitting on that big bay horse, glaring at me like I was the devil himself." "I thought you were going to ruin everything I had worked for," Zachary said. "Instead, you made it better. You showed me that there was room for more than one way of doing things, that strength comes from adapting, not from digging in your heels." "We did it together," Penelope said, squeezing his hand. "I never could have succeeded without you. You gave me a chance when no one else would, and you stood by me even when it cost you." "Best decision I ever made," Zachary said, leaning over to kiss her. "Marrying you, building this life with you, raising these children. This is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." "I love you," Penelope said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them. "And I love you," Zachary replied. "My stubborn, beautiful, impossible sheep woman who rode into my life and turned everything upside down." They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, and watched their children play in the fading light. The sheep and cattle grazed side by side on the land they had fought so hard to share, and in the distance, the town of Platteville glowed with the warm light of prosperity and peace. As the years continued to unfold, the Dalton Ranch became legendary not just in Colorado but throughout the West. Samuel grew into a serious young man with his father's head for business and his mother's compassion for animals. The twins, Grace and Clara, were as different as night and day. Grace followed her mother everywhere, learning the intricacies of wool production and sheep breeding, while Clara was her father's shadow, more interested in cattle and horses than anything else. In 1890, when Samuel was 10 and the twins were 7, Penelope gave birth to another son, Thomas, named after the faithful hired hand who had stood by her side in those early, dangerous days. Tom had passed away the previous winter, peacefully in his sleep, and Penelope wanted to honor the man who had believed in her when believing in a woman sheep rancher had been a radical act. The children thrived in the environment their parents had created. They learned early that cooperation was more valuable than competition, that innovation came from being willing to try new things, and that the land would provide for them if they treated it with respect. Zachary and Penelope made sure their children understood the history of the valley, the conflicts that had preceded their peaceful childhood, and the hard work that had gone into building the life they now enjoyed. By 1895, the wool from Platteville was sought after by mills throughout the eastern United States and even in Europe. Penelope had refined her breeding program to the point where her sheep consistently produced some of the finest fleece in North America, and other ranchers paid premium prices for breeding stock from her flock. She published articles in agricultural journals, sharing her techniques and advocating for better range management practices. Zachary was equally successful with his cattle operation, having developed a reputation for producing high-quality beef that commanded top dollar in the Denver markets. But success did not make them complacent. They continued to innovate, to experiment, to push the boundaries of what was possible. Zachary invested in windmills to provide reliable water sources across the ranch, allowing them to graze more land without damaging streams and springs. Penelope worked with agricultural scientists from the state university, testing new feeds and supplements that improved wool quality and sheep health. Together, they reforested sections of land that had been overgrazed in the early days of settlement, planting trees that would provide windbreaks and prevent erosion. The other ranchers in the valley watched and learned. What had begun as a single woman's stubborn refusal to be driven out had become a movement that transformed the entire region's approach to land use and livestock management. The old animosity between sheep and cattle ranchers faded, replaced by mutual respect and recognition that both industries could thrive if managed properly. In 1897, Samuel left for college in Denver to study agriculture and business. It was hard for Penelope to watch her firstborn ride away, even though she knew he would be back. Zachary held her as she cried, understanding her tears even as he assured her that Samuel would return stronger and better prepared to take over the ranch when the time came. With Samuel away, the twins stepped up to take on more responsibilities. At 14, they were both capable riders and workers, though their interests remained divided. Grace began to talk about expanding the wool cooperative to include finishing and weaving, creating value-added products that would bring even more profit to the sheep ranchers. Clara wanted to experiment with introducing new cattle breeds from Europe, animals that might thrive in Colorado's climate while producing superior beef. Zachary and Penelope listened to their daughter's ideas with pride and encouraged them to pursue their interests. They had built this ranch not just for themselves but for their children and grandchildren, and they wanted the next generation to feel the same passion for the land and the work that they did. Thomas, growing fast and curious about everything, became the family's comedian, always ready with a joke or a prank that would make his serious older siblings laugh. He adored the animals, all of them, and spent hours in the barns talking to the sheep and cattle like they were his best friends. Penelope saw echoes of her own childhood in Thomas's innocent joy in the rhythms of ranch life, and it filled her heart with contentment. In the autumn of 1899, the valley hosted a regional livestock exposition, and ranchers came from across Colorado and neighboring states to display their animals and techniques. Penelope and Zachary entered sheep and cattle in the competitions and won ribbons in nearly every category. But more importantly, they gave presentations on cooperative range management and sustainable practices that drew standing room-only crowds. After one particularly well-received talk, an elderly rancher approached Penelope with tears in his eyes. "Madam, 20 years ago, I was one of the men who tried to drive you out of this valley. I was at that meeting when Mr. Dalton first told you that you were not welcome. I just wanted to say that I was wrong, and I am sorry. What you have built here, what you and your husband have done for this valley, it is nothing short of remarkable." Penelope took the old man's weathered hand in hers and squeezed gently. "We all did what we thought was right at the time. The important thing is that we learned to work together. That is what made the difference." That evening, as she and Zachary walked back to their hotel room through the fairgrounds, he pulled her aside into the shadows and kissed her with the same passion he had shown on their wedding night 20 years earlier. "Have I told you lately that you are the most amazing woman I have ever known?" "Not since this morning," Penelope teased, wrapping her arms around his neck, "but I never get tired of hearing it." "You changed my life," Zachary said seriously. "You changed this whole valley. And you did it with nothing but determination and a flock of sheep." "And a cowboy who was willing to take a chance on me," Penelope added. "Never forget that part." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had started as adversaries and become partners in every sense of the word. And Penelope felt the same surge of love and gratitude she had felt every day since Zachary had first offered her sanctuary on his ranch. Their journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every struggle, every setback, every moment of doubt. When Samuel returned from college in 1901, he brought with him new ideas and modern techniques that he was eager to implement. Penelope and Zachary stepped back, giving their son room to make his mark while remaining available for guidance and support. Samuel proved to be a natural leader, combining his father's business acumen with his mother's innovative spirit. Under his management, the ranch continued to thrive and grow. Grace, meanwhile, had convinced several women in the valley to join her in establishing a wool processing cooperative. They purchased looms and dyeing equipment, and within a year, they were producing finished wool products, blankets, clothing, and tapestries that sold for premium prices in Denver and beyond. The cooperative provided employment for dozens of women and created a new revenue stream for the sheep ranchers. Clara married a young cattleman from Wyoming in 1903, and together, they started their own ranch on land that Zachary and Penelope gifted them as a wedding present. The young couple applied everything they had learned growing up on the Diamond D, and their operation quickly became known for its quality and innovation. Thomas, the baby of the family, surprised everyone by deciding to become a veterinarian. He left for school in 1905, determined to bring modern medical knowledge back to the ranching community. Penelope and Zachary supported his choice wholeheartedly, proud that their children had each found their own path while remaining rooted in the values they had been taught. As Penelope and Zachary moved into their 50s, they began to slow down, spending more time on the porch and less time in the saddle. But they never lost their passion for the work or their love for the land. They watched their grandchildren being born, Samuel's 2 boys and Grace's daughter, and saw the next generation beginning to take shape. On a crisp October evening in 1908, 30 years after Penelope had first driven her sheep into Platteville, she and Zachary hosted a celebration at the ranch. Everyone who had been part of their journey was there, children and grandchildren, ranch hands past and present, fellow ranchers and townspeople. They roasted beef and lamb over open fires, and as the sun set, Zachary stood to make a toast. 30 years ago, a stubborn woman with a flock of sheep rode into this valley and turned my world upside down, he began, his voice carrying across the gathering. I thought she was going to destroy everything I had built. Instead, she made it better. She taught me that there is always room for new ideas, that cooperation is stronger than conflict, and that love can grow in the most unlikely places. He turned to Penelope, his eyes shining with emotion. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that you were too stubborn to give up. Penelope stood and took his hand, looking out at the faces gathered around them, people whose lives had been touched and changed by what she and Zachary had built together. I came here with nothing but hope and determination, she said. I found a home, a family, and a love that has sustained me through everything. This valley, this community, all of you, you are proof that different ways can work together. That change is not something to fear, but something to embrace. And that sometimes the person who seems like your enemy can become your greatest ally and the love of your life. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Zachary pulled Penelope into his arms and kissed her as the stars began to appear overhead. Samuel stood with his arm around his wife. Grace held her daughter. Clara and her husband smiled at each other, and Thomas raised his glass in salute to his parents. The sheep grazed peacefully alongside the cattle on the Diamond D, just as they had for 3 decades, living proof that the impossible could become reality with enough determination, innovation, and love. Penelope's wool had indeed outsold beef in those crucial early years, proving the viability of her vision and forcing the entire valley to rethink its assumptions. But more than that, she had shown that a woman could succeed in a man's world, that cooperation was more powerful than conflict, and that love could bridge any divide. As the years continued to pass, Penelope and Zachary grew old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting. They had started as enemies and become partners, had fought against prejudice and tradition to create something new, and had proved that different ways could not only coexist, but could make each other stronger. The valley that had once seen sheep as a threat now recognized them as an essential part of a balanced, sustainable agricultural economy. The wool cooperative that Penelope had founded continued to thrive, providing income and opportunity for dozens of families. The techniques they had pioneered in range management were taught in agricultural colleges across the West, and the Diamond D Ranch stood as a monument to what could be achieved when stubborn determination met open-minded innovation. In 1915, when Penelope was 59 and Zachary was 64, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family. Samuel now ran the ranch with his younger brother Thomas, who had returned as the valley's veterinarian. Grace's wool cooperative employed over 100 women. Clara's ranch was one of the most successful in Wyoming. And their grandchildren, 7 in all, were growing up in a world that their grandparents had helped create, a world where sheep and cattle grazed side by side and no one thought it strange. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and the grandchildren were in bed, Penelope and Zachary walked out to the pasture where her original flock had first grazed when she came to the Diamond D. The sheep had been replaced several generations over, but the land remained the same, rich and green and beautiful under the Colorado sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Zachary asked, pulling her close. giving up your independence, coming to work for me instead of going it alone." Penelope laughed and looked up at her husband, this man who had been her adversary, her ally, her lover, and her partner for more than 3 decades. His hair was silver now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still that startling blue, and when he looked at her, she still felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt the first time they really saw each other. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me more than protection and a place for my sheep. You gave me a home, a family, and a love that has made every day worth living. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Zachary said, and kissed her under the stars, just as he had kissed her countless times over the years, each kiss a renewal of the promises they had made to each other. They stood together in the darkness, two people who had defied expectations and created something beautiful out of conflict, and watched the sheep settle down for the night while the cattle lowed softly in the distance. The land spread out around them, marked by their labor and love, a testament to what could be built when courage met opportunity and stubbornness met wisdom. Penelope had herded her sheep straight into cattle country, and every cowboy had raged, but in the end, her wool had not just outsold their beef. It had transformed the entire valley and proven that there was room for all kinds of ranching, all kinds of dreams. And in the process, she had found a love that transcended rivalry and built a legacy that would endure for generations. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, the moon rising over the mountains and casting silver light across the land they loved, Penelope felt complete contentment. She had taken a risk, had stood up for what she believed in, and had found not just success but happiness beyond anything she could have imagined. The sheep woman and the cattle king had written their own story, and it was one of triumph, transformation, and a love that had conquered everything in its path. In the years that followed, as Penelope and Zachary moved into their 70s, they watched their legacy continue to grow and evolve. Samuel and Thomas expanded the ranch to over 10,000 acres, making the Diamond D one of the largest and most successful operations in Colorado. They honored their parents' vision by maintaining the balance between sheep and cattle, and by continuing to innovate and adapt to changing markets and conditions. Grace's Wool Cooperative became a model for rural women's economic empowerment, featured in national magazines and studied by economists interested in cooperative business structures. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress about the importance of supporting rural industries, and she never forgot to credit her mother as the inspiration and driving force behind everything she had achieved. Clara and her husband's ranch in Wyoming became known for pioneering new breeding techniques that produced cattle perfectly adapted to mountain climates, and they sent their own children back to Colorado every summer to learn from their grandparents and understand the roots of their family's success. Thomas became one of the most respected veterinarians in the West, known for his gentle way with animals and his innovative treatments. He married a schoolteacher from Platteville, and they had 4 children who grew up hearing stories about how their grandmother had ridden into cattle country with nothing but a flock of sheep and a dream. On Penelope's 70th birthday in 1926, the state of Colorado honored her with a special award for her contributions to agriculture and women's entrepreneurship. The governor himself came to Platteville for the ceremony, and newspapers from Denver to New York covered the story of the sheep woman who had changed the West. At the ceremony, Penelope stood before a crowd of hundreds and spoke about her journey. "When I rode into this valley 48 years ago, I was terrified," she admitted. "I knew I was not welcome, knew that every man here saw me as a threat. But I also knew that I had nowhere else to go, and I refused to let fear stop me from trying to build a life. She paused and looked at Zachary, who sat in the front row with tears streaming down his weathered face. What I did not know was that the man who seemed like my greatest enemy would become my greatest love. That the valley that rejected me would become my home. That the work I started with one flock of sheep would transform an entire industry. She gestured to her children and grandchildren, standing proud and tall around the stage. This is not just my legacy. It belongs to every person who had the courage to try something new, to stand up for what they believed in, to work together instead of tearing each other down. It belongs to my husband, who took a risk on a stubborn sheep woman and never looked back. It belongs to every rancher in this valley who learned that cooperation is stronger than conflict. And it belongs to every woman who has been told she cannot do something and refused to believe it. The crowd rose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes, and when Penelope finally sat down, Zachary took her hand and held it tight. "I am so proud of you," he whispered, "prouder than words can say." "We did it together," Penelope whispered back, "every step of the way." That night, back at the ranch, surrounded by family, Penelope and Zachary danced together under the stars while a fiddle player performed old cowboy songs. They moved slowly, carefully, their bodies worn by decades of hard work, but their spirits still strong, still bound together by the love that had sustained them through everything. As the party wound down and the grandchildren were carried off to bed, Penelope and Zachary sat on their porch one more time, looking out over the land they had shaped together. The sheep were bedded down for the night, the cattle quiet in their pastures, and the moon hung full and bright over the mountains. "What do you think happens next?" Penelope asked, leaning her head on Zachary's shoulder. "Samuel and Thomas will keep building on what we started," Zachary said. "The grandchildren will grow up and make their own choices, follow their own dreams. But they will carry forward what we taught them, that hard work and innovation and cooperation can overcome any obstacle. And that love can bloom in the most unlikely places," Penelope added. "Especially that," Zachary agreed, kissing the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had lived a full and remarkable life together, who had started as adversaries and ended as soulmates, who had proved that determination and love could overcome any obstacle. The story of the sheep woman who herded her flock straight into cattle country and won over the hearts and minds of an entire valley would be told for generations, a testament to courage and innovation and the transformative power of love. Penelope Jensen and Zachary Dalton lived out their remaining years in happiness and peace, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that they had built something that would endure. When Penelope passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, the entire state of Colorado mourned, and newspapers across the country ran obituaries celebrating her remarkable life. Zachary followed her 2 years later, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the Diamond D, where sheep and cattle still grazed together on the land they had loved. Their children and grandchildren continued their work, and the valley remained a place where different ways coexisted and strengthened each other, just as Penelope and Zachary had always envisioned. The story of how she had herded sheep straight into cattle country, how every cowboy had raged, and how her wool had outsold their beef became legend, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables, a reminder that courage and love and stubborn determination could change the world. And on quiet nights when the moon rose over the mountains and the wind whispered through the grass, old-timers swore they could still see two figures standing on the hill where Penelope and Zachary were buried, looking out over the ranch they had built together. their hands joined and their love eternal, still watching over the land and the legacy they had created through sheer force of will and the power of a love that had conquered everything in its path.